our goal today is to, with all of these engaged journalism exchange conversations, is to connect journalists and researchers who are interested in engaged journalism to try to share ideas and experiences. And we'll try to be doing these Zoom conversations every month leading up to the AJMC pre-conference that we're planning, which will probably be remote in August, but we'll see. So today we're going to take a moment to debrief about the 2020 elections in the US. These were a reminder to all of us that democracy is not a given. And now that the dust is settling, at least in some ways, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on what role journalism can play in sharing and convening conversations around civic information. So today we're going to focus in particular on lessons learned from an effort to deploy engaged journalism practices around the elections, the Citizens Agenda Project, and how it was applied not only in newsrooms, but also in J schools. And we're going to hear a perspective both from a practitioner, someone who works with practitioners and journalists, and from a researcher. And so in a moment, we're going to hear from the amazing Sue Robinson of the University of Wisconsin. But first, Bridget Thoreson is the engagement manager of Hearken for Hearken. And I'll let Bridget share more about herself and the Citizens Agenda and Elections SOS project.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea and Ruby. I'm so excited to be here today. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. So I've got a few minutes to tell you a little bit about our work with newsrooms around engaged coverage for the election. And this was part of the Election SOS initiative. So that was led by Hearken. We closely worked with Trusting News on this. And I see a lot of our supporters on the call today, which is great. The American Press Institute, our fiscal sponsor. We had funding support from Democracy Fund, among others. Thank you. And our goal for the Election SOS project is to support journalists in responding to critical election information needs. So the engagement component of this was training cohorts that we kicked off last May in what we were calling engaged elections around the Citizens Agenda approach, which we'll be discussing today. We also had cohorts with trustworthy elections run by Trusting News, and all along the way we've been collaborating with Sue on her research, and she'll be able to tell you about that component of it. And I just want to flag, we're going to be talking about Citizens Agenda today, but Election SOS has a lot more components. We did a fellowship program. We distributed $200,000 in rapid response grants. We've got expert databases and resources around election needs. So if you want to find out more about any of that work, you can visit electionsos.org. So the basic framework for the Citizens Agenda component was, of course, inspired and guided by Jay Rosen of NYU, who's been talking about this model for some time. And way back at the start in 2019, we worked with Jay to produce a Citizens Agenda guide for newsrooms that is available for download at thecitizensagenda.org. You can download it, you can use it in your classes. Again, that is thecitizensagenda.org. Don't forget there's no website called citizensagenda.org. I've made that mistake many times. And the Citizens Agenda framework really hinges on asking audiences the key question: what do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? That's the main question. And this is an approach that's designed to surface what Jay calls, those kitchen table issues, the things that really people care about when they're looking to make an informed voting decision. And it's an entire engagement process around identifying how you can ask that question and engage with audiences around that question, and then use it to inform your election coverage. So in these training cohorts, we focused on how newsrooms could follow the stages of the Citizens Agenda approach as outlined in that guide, starting with setting their vision for the project, identifying who you want to ask that key question, and then getting that feedback and incorporating it into their reporting. And what's been fascinating to me is seeing how flexible this approach is. Like pretty much any platform or project you can imagine for this approach works. So we had 134 journalists from 63 newsrooms participate in the engaged elections cohort specifically, and many of them put the Citizens Agenda framework into action for their election coverage. And like I said, it's so flexible, like every newsroom had a different approach. You can also call it different things. Some people called it People's Agenda. Jay has said Citizens Agenda is just his term for it, call it whatever you want. But I want to share real briefly one example of the work that was produced as a result of this project, and then also some key takeaways from the experiences that I saw. So I want to talk about WBEZ, and Catherine Nagasawa is here today, who just has done a tremendous job with this approach. So Catherine, keep me honest. If I misstate anything, please let me know and you can clarify. But the goal of WBEZ's project was to help Chicago residents who've been hardest hit by COVID-19 get the information they needed to make informed civic decisions ahead of the November election. So the way they did this on the engagement side was sent out digital survey and also went in person to some of the communities hit hardest by the pandemic. They partnered with community organizations and they got more than, I think it's more than 2,200 now, right? More than 2,200 responses. And they used them to create features, interviews, talk show segments, and then also host locally focused virtual town halls with elected officials. And one thing I really want to highlight that I was so impressed by is close to half of the responses they got to that survey came from zip codes of communities that were hardest hit by COVID, many of which were areas traditionally underserved by the station where they didn't have too many members or listeners. And so this idea of understanding who you want to reach out to ask that key citizens agenda question really helped inform this citizens agenda work and also get that crucial information to communities. Also want to flag that one story they produced answering questions about voting drop boxes was the 5th most successful elections related story overall. I think he said 4th, not including the Election Day Live blog, which, like, how can you compete with that? And also what's so fascinating is they're moving this work forward based on, you know, some of the engagement planning mapping that they did to produce COVID vaccine events. So answering questions from the Latinx and African American communities in the area specifically. And, you know, they've said that this really helped templatize a process for planning and hosting community-driven events and coverage. One thing I really emphasized in these cohorts, and I'm going to turn things over to Sue, is that it's a process, not a product. I call it the engagement pizza stone, right? Every time you try something, it gets a little more delicious. And so I just wanted to thank WBZ for the incredible work they did moving this forward. Real quickly, sort of key takeaways that came up from me working with newsrooms in this cohort, and I do not think this will surprise anyone on the call today. Engagement still requires a lot of selling in newsrooms to make it happen, right? And a lot of questions about how to make the case for doing this work. Participants found it really important to create goals for their project, specific goals, and also be freed up to experiment with different approaches and iterate over time. There's sort of a big hump to get over to say, I want to pursue this engagement work, but does it have to be perfect and reach everybody the first time out? And of course, the answer is no, just try something and learn from it. Understanding the variety within the audiences was key, right? So not just thinking, well, one participant said after the training, I started to think of our audience less as an amorphous blob and more of as a collection of individuals with varied information needs. And so doing this mapping and understanding actually who needs the content you're trying to produce was really important. The citizens agenda approach, asking that question, we were expecting this would surface like new issues that weren't being covered. And sometimes it did, but mostly we heard from the journalists that newsrooms were already aware of the issues that were being brought up, but having the community articulate those issues helped them focus their coverage better on what mattered, right? There are so many things to choose. This helps you really hone in on what's relevant and impactful. And then lastly, I'd say I was absolutely blown away by the creativity and commitment that the newsrooms demonstrated and how many of them we're hearing want to continue this approach and other coverage moving forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sue. I want to give Catherine and the WBEZ team mad props again for their citizens agenda work and being such a shining example of what can be possible here. And I'll pop that link in the chat to the website where you can download the guide. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, and I put that in the chat as well. So what we did, so I'm a professor at the journalism school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so what I was interested in doing is trying to figure out how we can incorporate engagement strategies into reporting classes. And I was particularly interested in the citizens agenda because I thought it was this kind of very concrete way to try to refocus how students were thinking about sourcing, how they were thinking about audiences and whatnot. And so one of the things that I did is I combined what Bridget and her team were doing with the Citizens Agenda, with a list of a whole bunch of engagement strategies that I've been pulling from a lot of different projects and initiatives that have been going on for years and years, into a series of modules for educators. And we were able to pull together about 45 professors and instructors across the country and in the UK and Canada who are interested in kind of blowing up our reporting skills classes. And so we now have this network. And if you're not in the network and you're interested in being the network, please let me know in the chat or send me an email, because we're always expanding and we're interested in people who are just willing to sort of talk about how can we get some of these very foundational ideas about relationships with audiences at the ground level in our reporting 101 classes. And so I'm just going to share my screen so I can just show you the modules that we created. These are completely open and available if you're interested in looking at them. I created 4. Right now I'm analyzing how, well, we ended up having about 15 professors who actually implemented some version of these modules into their reporting classes. And so we've been interviewing all of them, and we surveyed all of the students. We had about 160 students altogether, asking them, like, how did it go? What were the challenges? You know, of course, COVID really kind of messed up a lot of people's semesters. A lot of our professors had shortened semesters. They were moving these reporting classes online. And so, you know, I was pretty psyched that we ended up having 15 people in that kind of environment still being able to do it. So this is, there's like a master table of contents. And I, from the interviews, I already know that I need to sort of work on the organization of these modules, but they're totally available. They're PowerPoints on basic engagement, class exercises, assignments, discussion strategies, and readings. And then there's a module on examining power and privileges. And all the PowerPoints are like 10 to 15 minutes long, and you can just do what you want with them. You can mess them up, you can add to them, you can slip them into existing slide decks already. We also did content collaborations, and we did community dialogues. And this network of 45 people really helped me sort of fill out some of these modules. Okay, and then I actually implemented about 3 of these modules fairly extensively in my advanced reporting class. And I did that by working with a company called Cortico, which is a nonprofit spinoff of the MIT Media Lab. And they have this program called Local Voices Network. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's basically, they're going around the country hosting community conversations around issues that matter to people. And so what we did in this class, and I'm explaining this because they are very interested in working with other local media and or universities on something similar. What we did in this class was we worked with the Capital Times, which took the Citizens Agenda training. They turned it into what they called People's Agenda, committed to it for the election. So we worked with Capital Times on the Citizens Agenda, collecting feedback and agenda item and all that. And then we chose from that agenda and worked with Local Voices Network to do 3 community conversations around those topics. And then Local Voices Network has a technology that allows you to analyze the conversations. Really cool technology. And then my students turned that information into stories for the Cap Times. And it worked out really well, even though we were in the middle of a pandemic, which I know a lot of you professors know, like how much that threw off our reporting classes in particular, because we're used to just sending people out and going to talk to people. And it was just really hard for them to do that. This gave us a structure that allowed us to, because we were working with the Cap Times, we had those connections through the Cap Times. And because we were working with Local Voices Network, we were able to do these facilitated conversations in a way that was super meaningful. And I'm just going to share my screen one more time because I want to show you one really cool outcome of this was this. So here's the Cap Times. The Cap Times ran a story on this police chief search that people wanted to talk more about. So we had a community facilitation around this topic, and then the police chief search committee used our conversation to inform their search. So that was like super successful and like so nice to be able to really have kind of a real impact. And my students were really, really psyched about that. And so I highly recommend trying to do something like that. I can totally put you in touch with anybody from Local Voices Network. And if you have a local media station that you think might be willing to work with your class, that's totally something that they would do. Or if you're interested in some of these modules that we created, I'll be spending the summer kind of fixing them and adding to them and whatnot. So in addition, I'll just finish up by saying I'm still working with Bridget and her team on evaluating how everything happened, right? So there was the election, and then before that there were the primaries. We've been surveying the newsrooms who were involved in that, and Bridget and her team are interviewing them, and we're going to pool all that data. But I'll just echo some of the findings that Bridget first mentioned, which is, having some kind of a pitch to your newsroom, because one of the things where I'm noticing is that sometimes the people who are committed to these engagement strategies were all by themselves in the newsroom. And so that was great that they had somebody in those newsrooms, but we're trying to make a paradigm shift here in the industry. And so anything that we can do to sort of get more people on board about different kinds of relationships with audiences, I think is super important. So I'm just going to end there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I know that Andrea and Jake want to do breakout rooms.
Thank you, Sue. Andrea is clearly getting Ruby out of her chair. So I'm going to, before we get into breakout rooms, start a Q&A. I figured we would all just participate in for a few minutes and then we would do the breakouts. So I'm going to ask the first question, but while I'm asking it and while Bridget and Sue are answering it, I encourage everyone else here to please put some questions in the chat. It's a small enough group that if you have a question, there's no reason why you shouldn't ask it, and we'll definitely be able to get to it. But the question that I have, something that I think is really cool about this initiative is that it's attempting to address issues within journalism practice and journalism education. And I was wondering if Sue and Bridget, you could talk about why you felt it was important to try to tackle both of those things within the same project. So maybe Sue, you want to start, and then Bridget, you can go.
I mean, I think it was more serendipity because I was already working on the J School part of this in terms of engagement strategies from a couple of years of data collection. And then I don't even remember how I met Bridget. I went to some, and Regina was there. Like, I don't know, there was a whole bunch of people. Joy Mayer was there, and
maybe it was at the Hearken Summit, October. No, it would have been before then. I don't know.
That was where we met formally, and we all got together and decided to have this team. And so I think it just became organic in the sense that there were a lot of synergies between us. I always promised myself after I got out of journalism, I'd never say the word synergies again, but I just did. And they just kind of work well together. And my argument has always been, like we can change the industry all we want, but if we're still teaching our journalism students these very kind of traditional understandings of how to engage with people, and then we send them off to be hired by all the newsrooms, we kind of defeat the whole purpose. So we have to get journalism schools involved in this paradigm shift.
I'd agree it was very serendipitous. And I think too, Jacob, there was a lot of urgency around this particular project for the 2020 election, right? So there's a lot of short-term, what can we do now? But on the flip side of that was this idea that this is a framework that can be used moving forward. And so if we're able to give this framework to newsrooms, then also give it to J school students to incorporate in their own reporting, it's so flexible, it's so adaptable. You can do the citizens agenda for the vaccine rollout, like you can do it for all these different things. It really is sort of, a very clear roadmap to engagement. That's going to work out really well. And we had a number of student newsrooms participate in our cohorts, and they did just excellent work. And it was such a joy to see, there would be a group of students paired with people from the Wall Street Journal, and they're talking through the same issues and they're learning from each other and the work that they've done. And that's not a thing that you see happen very often across journalism.
Jake, you're muted.
Thank you. Could either or both of you talk about the challenges that you faced as you tried to put this together? And I guess specifically what I'm interested in is maybe comparing the challenges or resistance that you faced trying to bring this into journalism schools with the challenges and resistance that you faced bringing it into newsrooms. Since, Bridget, I'm sure with your work at Hearken, you were very familiar with making those inroads at newsrooms, and maybe the J school part of this was somewhat new to you, and vice versa for Sue.
I can talk about the challenges for newsrooms first, Sue, if that's okay. So leaving aside pandemic logistics, all right, so that whole big bucket, we knew, I knew from my work at Hearken that we didn't have time to convert the unconverted to this idea that engagement would be an important approach, right, to election coverage. There just wasn't time. We came out with a guide in September of 2019. So what was really great was by the time we were ready to launch in spring of 2020, we already had a built-in audience who had taken that initial step of at least checking out the guide, and it indicated curiosity for this approach. And then with the cohorts themselves, it was actually an application process. And some of the questions we asked were things like, how much is your newsroom committed to engagement? How do you serve marginalized and underrepresented communities? Like trying to get a sense. And we would evaluate the applicants based on how ready they seemed to put this work into practice. And then another challenge we had, which again will surprise none of you, is we were talking, for 2 virtual meetings a week, hour and a half each for 4 weeks straight. That's hard. That's hard to carve time aside that time. And I honestly was a little nervous when my co-facilitator was like, let's just tell them they're required to show up. They have to come. And I'm like, but what if there's a story? But being very clear, like, look, you have to come to get what you want out of this. People showed up. I was amazed. Like, frankly, I was really amazed, but they found the time. And I think what made that work was they found the value there. So a lot of it had to do with like making sure you had buy-in, making sure you had the time to dedicate to the strategy, and that we're getting those most able to move this work forward. Sue?
Yeah, I mean, and the pandemic was just a huge challenge. Frankly, it's especially for the journalism schools. Like I said, a lot of people had shortened semesters, which meant that if you implemented some of this stuff. So I think like most of my professors who used the modules used the power and privilege module. And I think we're finally at a point in J schools where we're starting to see just that's an essential part of any reporting class today is power and privilege. But what the rest of it meant is that you had to get rid of something else, right? And then what are you going to get rid of? Are you going to get rid of how to interview someone? Are you going to get rid of how to write a lead? No, you can't get rid of that stuff. And so that's the huge challenge for these different classes. But my goal is to bake these different ideas about engagement, whether or not we actually teach the skills, but the philosophy that reporters are working from within community rather than standing a critical distance apart has to be part of the foundational premise of what it is that we're teaching. And I think that needs to replace, objectivity. And I'm sure some people on this call probably disagree with me, which is fine. So to get to Christy's question in the chat, I haven't been seeing curriculum changes. This has been mostly these professors and instructors who are very committed to trying to do a paradigm change, at least in their classes, and they're doing it a little bit at a time.
I have so many more questions for you, Sue, about what you're seeing in J schools, but since we're getting questions in the chat, I'm going to start going through those. Caroline, if you don't mind, can I put you on the spot and ask you to actually read or paraphrase your question for Sue and Bridget?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Maybe not if you can. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry. We've got a major snowstorm in Memphis where I'm based, and internet is an issue. So just give me a heads up if I cut out. But essentially, yeah, I've loved following this project from afar, and with school board elections in the pandemic, especially, we applied a lot of the principles kind of informally to our process. And part of it was involving students and teachers early in our kind of forum planning and election guides that we produced, but also wanting to involve them in the events themselves. And so like kind of an easy way we were able to do that was to ask high school students to co-moderate the panels with us, the forums with us. But I'd love to hear other examples. We're always looking for ways to elevate students and teachers in particular. Yeah, so I'm just curious if there are other examples of involving readers during the events that come to mind.
That's a really great question. I also love to see that, Caroline. So one example that comes to mind immediately is New Mexico PBS did a citizens agenda approach for their hosting of the Senate debates, the Arizona Senate debates. And they partnered with 2 organizations specifically to reach African-American and Latinx communities. And again, they weren't really surprised by the questions they got, but through their partnership of that organization, they said the questions had such a depth and richness to them. And then also it helped them hold the sending candidates a lot more accountable, right? Because they're answering directly to these communities versus just, you know, a question that a journalist came up with. And so what they did in order to elevate sort of the voices of that experience is, while the debate itself followed a pretty standard format, although the questions were audience-based, they then hosted a virtual conversation on Facebook Live with the partnering organizations about how it went and how they felt about it, and like discussing how to build on that for next time. And I really appreciated how they made that publicly available and tried to work out those partnerships and in ways that were very visible, and also held them to a standard of accountability. And I hope that's a nice example for what you were looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, Christy, I see you have a question that was sort of a little bit addressed by Sue before, but do you want to maybe ask it in a different way or ask it again and we can have a longer conversation about this?
Well, and I think Sue did a good job answering it. I was really just curious to know if like what we, a lot of newsrooms, there's kind of like the one person that champions the work and tries to make it work, if that's sort of the same thing you were seeing in the classrooms. And I'm just really interested in like elevating that conversation. This is a conversation that I have with my colleagues all the time at my school. So it was, you know, I kind of figured that was the answer, and hope we can talk about that more later. But
yeah, I mean, and I've also been seeing it in the surveys from the journalists too, that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times there's just like a team who has been tasked with the engagement stuff. And then the regular like political coverage just happens. The same happened to, I think with the journalism schools though, I feel like, I mean, I couldn't believe, I was hoping to get 10 professors interested in this little network that I was creating. And we got like 45. I mean, I'm just kind of, I feel like we're at an apex of change, where we are starting to see this, you know, the time for engagement to be baked into all of these very basic practices. So I also feel like the fall with the pandemic was nearly impossible to do any kind of major curriculum change because people were still trying to figure out even how to just teach online. And a lot of people were doing both in person and virtual, and it was just a lot. So I'm hoping as we get out of this pandemic, that we will be able to embrace this and really be able to move forward now that we've set a foundation.
And I guess I just would like to say, I'd love to see something that was written for administrators or leadership or curriculum designers, that was the audience from these takeaways, because I think that would be different than than other professors, because I think that would be really helpful.
That's a great idea. Thanks, Christy.
Doug, I see you've got a question more about the actual process by which this work was getting done. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. We've had a great process in Your Voice Ohio, having journalists participate with people in our conversations so that they are, as I think Bridget said, in a part of the community, or maybe Sue said that, as opposed to standing on the outside. And as they listen, journalists are inclined to write narratives because they want to be proud of their narratives. As we got to the end of this round, we talked about, what do you hear people saying that they need? And what's amazing is, in the dialogues, people realize that they have more shared issues than they thought. They thought they were more divided. And they find this empowering so that they feel like they want to take action. And what comes from that is they want lists on which they can act, possible solutions that will improve their lives or their neighborhoods. We talked about that in a reporter's conversation afterwards, and everybody admitted, we hate doing lists. They're hard, and they don't allow us to show off our ability to write narrative. Did you run into this issue, and what are ways to convince reporters that these are critical parts of your product in serving your community?
Oh man, Doug, that question gets to so many things. It's absolutely brilliant. I have to say, by and large, the Citizens Agenda work I've seen so far, the products are largely typical news products, stories, etc., some events, but not necessarily lists, with the notable exception of, I'm going back to WBEZ again, the Field Guide to Local Government in Chicago. Catherine, keep me honest. Do you want to speak to it? Not to put you on the spot. I just hate to talk about work that's not mine when the person who actually did the work is here.
Yeah, I can definitely share a little bit about it.
Sure.
So what we did was we ended up taking some of the top topics that we saw coming up in the survey, and we sort of flipped the whole model of, instead of covering the candidates, we started with the issue, and we broke down then, if you care about police funding in Chicago, here are all the different people, government agencies, the mayor, this is their role in deciding police budgeting. And so I can send the link in the chat. Maybe it's easier to show it rather than explain it, but it kind of reversed the traditional kind of horse race coverage. And we found that it was like a much easier access point for everyday people to come in to something from the issue rather than the political office or like the role.
Thank you so much. And what I love about this, Doug, is it's a usable guide, right, for people for the information they said they needed. I mean, WBZ is doing stories about like which city officials are in charge of the rat problem, because the rat problem is a huge deal. And I've certainly never had a reporter pitch to me, let's write about the rat problem, right? And I think the way to indicate the utility of this, Doug, is it goes back to having a real clear goal for the project. Because when we're working with the newsrooms and saying, what's your vision for your election coverage? Mostly they didn't have very strong answers at first. They want to be like, well, we want to create good stories, right? They're thinking in terms of stories. But when you say, we want to help people make informed decisions, anything that helps them do that then becomes a reasonable part of the journalism you're producing. And so if a list is going to help people make an informed decision, then you're achieving your project goal that you've set at the outset.
Okay, so let's do one last question before we move into the breakout sessions. Angelica, do you want to ask this? I think this is just such a great question to leave things off at the end of this conversation.
Yeah, so Cole's comment earlier got me thinking, as well as a call that I was on just before this one, where it surfaced that the next generation. So I think, that incorporates the folks who are in journalism school now, but also younger, they don't necessarily identify with the journalism profession in the same way that I think probably most of us on this call do in a more traditional form. And so the fact that that module was so well received and utilized on facilitation and dialogue, I think speaks to how that generation maybe thinks about communities differently. And there was even the idea brought up that, you know, maybe there's opportunity to lean more into this idea of influencers, which has a very negative connotation, but for the people, for folks who embrace that culture, has to do with how they interact with their community, and engage and communicate. And so I'm wondering, you know, if this is, if it's building for anyone really on this call, if this is building toward, you know, a change in culture and journalism where these principles of organizing and facilitation are less at odds with how the professionalization of journalism has traditionally existed, and the culture of objectivity, which I also happen to believe is deeply flawed. Side note.
Bridget, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just feel like because of you've been working at Hearken for a while, and you just over the last year, I assume, have been part of conversations with newsrooms about this very topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you. Oh God, it's such an interesting question. I was just on a call with an editor who the principles of activism came up as part of our conversation about engagement, and he was so uncomfortable with it. He was physically like cringing and like clawing at his chest, like to protect himself from this idea. So what's been really interesting to me in my work with newsrooms is I have not yet seen that tipping point where if you just come straight out the gate and say, you know, activism is journalism, there's no such thing as objectivity, the people will be like, yes, we agree. However, if you lead them sort of down this path of therefores, they get there on their own. So when we're talking about, you know, the citizens agenda approach to help communities make critical information choices in their election, like, yeah, journalists are activists for democracy. We saw that with the fall election, media organizations standing up and saying, we support the democratic process, we support democracy, we're going to call out lies as lies. And journalists are activists for information and providing information that's going to help people make informed decisions, not necessarily saying what those decisions should be, but if you do accept that you are pushing, your mission is to serve people in making informed choices, that's a stance, that's a perspective, that's going to lead you to make choices. And so what's so interesting is you feel people who are comfortable with the mission, then following that to its logical conclusion. But to your point, Angelica, I think starting out with the idea of objectivity is still such a tenet and a bulwark that you have to look more at the influence of the work they're doing. I hope that makes sense. Good, I'm seeing nods.
And Sue, do you want to maybe very briefly share what your experience has been working with other educators or J schools, or maybe just how your own thoughts or conversations with other educators has been basically over the last year about objectivity, about engaged journalism? I mean, are you seeing that when you have conversations with people who teach the intro to reporting classes, these concepts of engaged journalism are less moments of tension or friction for them as they think about objectivity and things that went sort of taken for granted for a long time?
I mean, I think Bridget and Angelica are completely right. There's still this need to idealize objectivity and at least to strive towards it, even if everybody agrees it's not a good thing. It's not such a thing. So I'm having the same kinds of conversations, and I agree with Bridget, like I think making kind of these blatant statements are not useful because you just automatically set people into binaries. Instead, I'm trying to develop a conversation around like, what are the principles journalism? What are the values of journalism? And how do we teach in these classrooms a different kind of relationship with audiences that sort of transcends any questions about objectivity? So yeah, I mean, I think it's even in my own department, we have these very set kind of understandings of how journalism should be taught. And even though we don't really talk about objectivity, it's still very much underpinning everything that we do. And so it's, you know, even some of the people who were just using the basic engagement strategies modules and totally ignored the power and privilege. Like I was talking to one person and they're like, well, you know, we don't really, we really don't have time to talk about this other stuff. So we're just gonna like concentrate on these two things that I pulled from the modules. So it really has to be incremental.
Thank you. So that Q&A went longer than we had originally planned, but that's good because I was really excited about all these questions. We're now going to do a very short breakout room. I put the question prompt for it in the chat, but I'll read it out loud here. And that question is, now that the elections are over, how might you think about using engaged journalism strategies to cover civic information going forward, either in your newsrooms or in your journalism classes? So these are gonna be really quick, very casual. We're a small group, so these breakout sessions are gonna be very, very small, which I think will be nice since it seems like most of you know each other anyway. And we'll come back together in about 10 minutes or so and do a very quick share back before we close things out for the day. Andrea, do you want to do? Okay, great. Okay, I just got my prompt, so I'll see you all in a few minutes.
Jake, I'll let you kind of close us off here.
Okay, well, since we're already so close to the end, we don't really have the time that we thought we'd have for like the share back. So Andrea, I was just gonna sort of wind us down if that's cool with you.
That's fine, unless anybody had like a really short hot take.
Yeah, does anyone have a very short comments from their conversation that they'd like to share very quickly?
I'll jump in, mostly because I was so passionate that I talked through the last second. So we had a great share with our room. And one of the things we discussed was that, like for me, I come into journalism by way of documentary filmmaking. And one of the things that I learned, you know, in my MFA program is that when you show up with a camera, there's no such thing as objectivity. You immediately change the room. People change their demeanor. You as an editor have the ability to edit out and to construct a story. So while the goal is still to remain rooted in truth, there was always for me an acknowledgement of my role, you know, as the storyteller, as the documentarian. And so I bring that with me to journalism. And so, yeah, just in keeping it short, I'll leave that there. You know, I consult with WURD now, used to be the program director there. And as one of the only Black-owned talk media stations in the country, I can see how this way of thinking could really help to expand equitable journalism and, you know, feed into this work of engaged journalism.
Thank you. Oh, that was wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, this has been awesome. I know that I speak for both Andrea and myself when I say that we are so glad to be doing these again. It's been really fun having just this excuse to get people together that we really love hearing from and talking to and getting to talk about these topics. So thank you so much for taking the time for it. As Andrea said at the beginning, we plan to continue doing these on a monthly basis leading up to the August AJMC, when we hope to be doing this as a pre-conference again, as we did last year. If you have suggestions for topics that we should be focused on, or just how to make this better and more seamless, please feel free to reach out. We'll be sending you some sort of feedback form that you can fill out. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And I think that's about it. Andrea, did I cover just about everything? You can just nod.
And we'll circulate a link to this, so if anybody wants to watch it afterwards and let you know that. But thank you all. I really appreciate it. Sorry, snow day challenges of not being able to be more vocal.
And thank you again, Bridget and Sue, for taking the time for this. It's really great hearing about this project and really just a fun excuse to talk about this stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you. Good to see everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
See you all
Waving.
next time.
Bye.
Take care.